Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello dear learners, welcome to the session of Managerial Economics. I am Dr. Supriya Jain, working as an assistant professor in the Institute of Business Management at GLU University, Mathura. So let us start with our today's session. Before we start, let us look at the topics we have covered in our previous session. In our last session, we have talked about law of demand, which state that keeping other thing constant, when the price of commodity increases, the demand for that commodity decreases and vice versa. So, here in this lecture we have discussed about law of demand, law of diminishing marginal utility, and this laws explain how the marginal utility of any item decreases as in when we keep on consuming that commodity. Thereafter, we have talked about the reasons behind law of demand, why there is an existence of law of demand and why does it happen when the price of any commodity increases, its demand decreases. That happens because of the substitution effect, because we have substitutes available in the market. So, in case in price of any commodity increases, people shift their demand to the substitute product. It is also because of the income effect, though the income of a person is not changing because we have already assumed it to be constant, but yes, whenever the price of any commodity reduces or increases, it affects the purchasing power of a person. So, when a price of a commodity decreases, the purchasing power of a person increases and they can demand more of that commodity, which causes the increase in the demand. Thereafter, we have seen the relationship of law of diminishing marginal utility with law of demand, which also suggests that as and when we keep on consume any commodity, its marginal utility decline, and for a rational person, before making any choice, they always analyze their cost and benefit. So, people are ready to pay up to the point where their price is equals to the utility, but definitely they would not like to make a purchase where prices are more than utility. So, simply with this law of diminishing marginal utility, we can say when the prices are low for any commodity, people can demand more of the quantity of that commodity because the marginal utility keeps on decreasing. The another reason we have talked here is the new consumer, the people who are not able to afford that commodity earlier. Now, because the price of that commodity decreases, it becomes affordable and new set of customer add to it, which increases the demand. And lastly, we have talked about the different uses of commodity. In this, we have seen that there are certain commodities which can be used for different purposes, right. But because when the price of those commodities are higher, we use them for their very specific purpose, whereas when the price reduces, we try to use them more and more for different purposes, which increases their demand. So, there were some reasons because of which law of demand exists. That is what we have discussed here in this point. Thereafter, we have talked about exceptions to law of demand. The law of demand says that when price of any commodity increases, its demand decreases, but yes, there are certain areas where law of demand does not work, like in the case of given goods, those are the special categories of inferior good, like in case of those goods which are purchased for maintaining or representing the status in the society, right. The goods which are of having no substitute, right, or the goods in case of emergencies we are requiring. So, there also law of demand does not exist, or the items on which we spend very insignificant proportion of our income, necessary items, right. So, these are some reasons where we have discussed that these are the areas where law of demand will not work. Thereafter, we have also talked about supply, which is again very important, because when we have talked about demand, it is also important for us to know what supply is, and supply is basically from the producer. So, it represents the willingness and the ability of a producer to supply at a given price at a given point of time, right. Thereafter, we have seen about market equilibrium. Market equilibrium is the state of balance where the aggregate demand is equals to the aggregate supply, right. When demand and supply is equal, that means our market is in equilibrium, and which represent that the consumers are ready to buy on the price on which the sellers are also ready to sell. Thereafter, we have also talked about the determinants of supply, what are the factors which reflect the supply of a commodity. Again, the prime being the most prominent factor which affects the supply, but yes, here in the case of supply, the impact of price will be positive. In case of demand, there is an inverse relationship between the demand and price, because consumer wants to demand more on the lesser price, whereas supplier wants to supply more on the higher price, because that will generate revenue for them. And the other factors are like the cost of production, like state of technology, like number of firms available, government policies also affect the supply of any commodity. So, again there are different determinants which affects the supply, and those were discussed. Thereafter, we have talked about the law of supply. Again, in the case of law of supply, we assume other factors to be constant, the other determinants which can affect the supply. We here understand the effect of price on the supply, and we see that whenever the price of any commodity increases, the supply for that commodity also increases. And in the last heading, we have talked about supply function, which represents the mathematical relationship between the demand and its determinants. We have talked about the schedule, which also shows the tabular representation of different quantities supplied at different prices. Supply curve is a graphical representation of demand, supply schedule, where we have seen there is a direct relationship between the supply and the price, and the supply curve will always be upward sloping. And lastly, we have talked about the shifts in supply curve, and supply curve will shift either upward or downward because of change in the factors other than price, right. If supply will increase, it will shift to the right, and when supply will decrease, it will shift to the left, right. So, these were the topics which were discussed in our previous class, and now let us look at the learning objective of today's session. In this session, we are going to talk about how we can understand the concept of elasticity, and how this elasticity concept is being used in calculating different decisions in the management. So, to comprehend and to apply the concept of elasticity, here we are going to calculate price elasticity of demand, cross elasticity of demand, income elasticity of demand, as well as price elasticity of demand. So, these are the headings which we are going to cover in our today's session, and these are the learning objectives which you are going to get. So, let us start with the very first, where we are going to talk about elasticity of demand. Now, what is meant by this elasticity? Elasticity is basically going to help you to understand the change taken place, right. How much change has been taken place in the quantity demanded because of change in the factors affecting the demand. So, the elasticity concept will explain you the quantitative aspect, right. In law of demand, we have seen that we have only studied whenever the price increases, demand will decrease, or whenever the price decrease, price will increase, and vice versa. This is what we have studied in law of demand, but we were not able to identify what change has been taken place in the quantity demanded, right. So, with the elasticity concept, we are able to understand what change has been taken place, and that is why we are saying it as in quantitative aspect of price demand relationship. The elasticity of demand is the ratio of change in the quantity demanded due to the change in the variables affecting the demand. So, very simple, we can define elasticity of demand. That means what change has been taken place in the quantity demanded due to the factors change affecting the demand, right. It can be the price also, it can be the income also, it can be the price of related goods also, it can be the taste and preference also, it can be the advertisement of that commodity. So, whatever the factors, whatever the determinants of demand we have discussed, because of that, if the quantity demanded changes and we are studying one specific factor at a time, that is to be considered as an elasticity of demand. So, the degree of responsiveness of demand to the change in its determinant is called as elasticity of demand. Moving ahead, we can read out the definitions given by different people regarding this elasticity of demand, and sometimes we also define it in terms of change taking place in the price, because we all know price is the most important factor which affects the demand of any commodity. So, in the words of Professor A. Cross, the elasticity of demand for a commodity is the rate at which the quantity bought changes as the price changes, right. What change has been taken place in the quantity demanded, because of change in the price of that commodity, that is basically considered to be as an elasticity of demand. Whereas, in the words of Professor Istham, the elasticity of demand is the measure of the responsiveness of quantity demanded to the change in price. Okay. So, almost the same thing we are talking here, but in a broader sense when we talk about elasticity of demand means whenever we are understanding the change, whenever we are calculating the change taken place in the quantity demanded due to the change in the factors affecting demand, and these factor can be price, can be income, can be any other determinant which affects the demand, right. So, now this is how we calculate it, this is the formula through which we can calculate the elasticity of demand. Elasticity of demand can be denoted this way, small e and then d for demand, right. Percentage change of the quantity demanded delta q upon delta, right, p, or you can say the determinants of demand, whatever the determinants of demand we are calculating. If we are calculating it with the price, so we will write change in the price. If we are calculating it with the income, then we will write the change in income, or whatever the factor we are studying at that point of time, we will denote it accordingly. So, right now we are saying that elasticity of demand is equals to percentage change in the quantity demanded divided by percentage change in the determinants of demand, right. Now, here we are going to understand the difference between the law of demand and the elasticity of demand, right. As you all know what law of demand is and what is elasticity of demand, now you will be able to make out the difference between these two concepts. Starting with the very first point, we are going to understand the meaning, right. Law of demand, as we have studied, that it states keeping other factors to be constant, when price increases demand decreases, and when price decreases demand increases, right. So, vice versa takes place in case of law of demand, whereas in elasticity of demand what we are doing, we are measuring the change. Okay. In law of demand we are only calculating, or we are only establishing the relationship between the price and demand, whereas in elasticity of demand we are measuring the change in the quantity demanded due to the change in the factors affecting the demand, right. If you look at the nature of both, law of demand is qualitative in nature because it is only establishing the relationship, whereas elasticity of demand is quantitative in nature, right. It is helping you to measure that change. So, that is why this concept is quantitative in nature, right. If you look at the relationship in law of demand, we are only establishing the relationship between the price and the demand, right. Law of demand specifies that there is an inverse relationship, because we are only studying the impact of price on demand, and price is inversely related to the demand. So, here the relationship will only be negative or inverse you can say, whereas as because elasticity can establish the relationship between the price, income, taste and preference, price of related goods. So, here the relationship can be positive also, negative also, or there can be a zero impact. Okay. And lastly, we are saying that there are factors which we are considering for law of demand is only price. Price is the only factor which is being taken into the consideration for the study of law of demand, whereas in elasticity of demand we can establish the relationship how much change has been taken place in the quantity demanded due to the price, income, substitutes, advertisement and so on, right. So, this is how we basically differentiate between the law of demand and the elasticity of demand. One thing which you can remember is law of demand is a qualitative aspect because it only establishes the relationship which only help us to understand that price has a inverse relationship with the demand, whereas in the elasticity concept we not only establish the relationship, but we also find out the change taken place, how much change, right, has been taken place in the quantity demanded due to the change in the factors affecting demand. And here the relationship can be inverse, it can be positive, that means negative relationship can be there, there can be a positive relationship, or there can be a situation where there is no change taking place. Okay. So, now let us move back to the concept of elasticity, and here we are going to understand the different type of elasticities. Okay. So, the concept of elasticity is already known to every one of us now, where we have understood that here we are going to measure the change taken place in the quantity demanded due to the change in the factors affecting the demand, Now we are going to understand the different types of elasticities, and majorly we are going to talk about the price elasticity, income elasticity and cross elasticity. Though there can be different elasticities which can be discussed, and there can be different types of elasticities like advertisement elasticity can be studied, taste and preference elasticities can be studied. So, that depends upon the factor which you are taking into the consideration for your study. But as we all know, these are the most important factors which affects the demand of any commodity. So, for that reason we are going to talk about price elasticity, income elasticity and cross elasticity in detail. So, let us start with the price elasticity. This name will only help you to understand what are we going to do in this elasticity. So, very simply we can say that with price elasticity of demand, we try to find out how much change taken place in the quantity demanded due to the change in the price of the commodity. So, price elasticity of demand can be defined as the ratio of percentage change in the quantity demanded of a commodity to the percentage change in its own price, right. If you are talking about a commodity X, then what change has been taken place in the demand of commodity X because of change in the price of commodity X. So, this is how we write this formula to calculate this price elasticity, where we are saying percentage change in the quantity demanded upon percentage change in price. The another way of writing this formula can be percentage change, that is the delta Q upon delta P, and the another way you can write down here is Q1 minus Q, that means the new quantity is Q1 and the older quantity which was demanded on the old price was Q, that means the difference among the both divided by the old quantity, and then new price minus the old price divided by the old price. So, this is how we use this formula to calculate the change taken place in the quantity demanded due to the change in the price. Now, let us look at the degrees of price elasticity, right. Price elasticities are further divided into 5 types, because there are different types of commodities which are available, and these commodities have different impact, they have different impact of prices, right. So, here we have classified the degrees of price elasticities into 5 types. We have perfectly elastic demand, we have perfectly inelastic demand, relatively elastic, unitary elastic and relatively elastic. So, these are the 5 degrees of price elasticities. Depending upon the nature of commodity, we have different impact of prices on the quantity demanded. So, let us start with the very first point, where we are going to understand perfectly elastic demand. Perfectly elastic demand is the case where the price even if the price is not changing, right, causing no change in the price affects lot of change in the quantity demanded, and that is why we are denoting this perfectly elastic demand with infinity. Okay. So, perfectly elastic demand is denoted this way. Here your elasticity will be infinite. Okay. So, demand is said to be perfectly elastic if the quantity demanded increases infinitely or by unlimited quantity with a small fall in price, or quantity demanded falls to 0 with a small rise in the price. This is known as infinite elasticity. Okay. So, this is the case of perfectly elastic demand, and this is how we represent it on the graph. You can see that on the x axis we have quantity demanded, and on the y axis we are representing the demand, and this line shows that there is no change in the price taken place, even that at the same prices different quantities are being demanded, that is Q1, Q2 and Q3. So, lot of change has been taking place in the quantity demanded with no change in the price, and that is how we define it as an perfectly elastic demand. And this is the case which does not exist in a real life situation, because there are no such goods basically where we have this perfectly elastic demand without a change in the price causes lot of change in the quantity demanded. So, this was your perfectly elastic demand. Then we have perfectly inelastic demand, right. Now, this is just an opposite to it. Now, here the demand is perfectly inelastic, and that is why we are denoting it with 0, right. Our price elasticity in this case will be equals to 0, and in this case what happened, a perfectly inelastic demand is the one where there is no change produced in the demand of the product with the change in its price, right. Now, even if you are increasing the price or the price are decreasing, even if there is no change in the quantity demanded, the quantity demanded will remain same, and this is how we represent perfectly inelastic demand, where the elasticity is equals to 0. An example can be medicine, an example can be salt, right. If the price of salt increases, you can't you are not going to decrease its consumption. Even if the price of salt decreases, you will not increase its consumption. So, in this case your demand will remain same, there will be no change. In the case of medicines also, if the price of medicine reduces, will you start taking more medicines? No, right. Even if the price of medicine increases, will you stop taking those medicines which are being prescribed for you? No. So, in these cases, even if the price of that commodity increases or decreases, the demand does not get affected, and this is the case of perfectly inelastic demand, where the elasticity is equals to 0. Moving ahead, we have unitary elastic demand. Now, what is this unitary elastic demand? Here the elasticity will be equals to 1. That means, whatever the change is been taking place in the quantity demanded is equals to the change taking place in the price of the commodity, right. The change is equal. So, when the proportionate change in the demand produces the same change in the price of the product, the demand is referred to as unitary elastic, and the numerical value we are associating here is equals to 1. And one thing which you have to remember here is the curve which we are going to study here is in the shape of rectangular hyperbola. Let me show you the curve. This is how we represent the unitary elastic demand, which says that earlier when the price was P1, the quantity demanded was M1, and when price increases to P, the demand decreases to M, right. And the change which is taking place here is same. Here the price change in price is equals to the change in demand. Say suppose if the price decreases by 5%, then demand increases by also 5%. So, the percentage change here is same, and the shape which we are getting here for the curve is known as rectangular hyperbola. Okay. So, this is the shape which we call for the unitary elastic demand, that is rectangular hyperbola. Then we have relatively elastic demand. Now, this is the case where elasticity is lesser than 1. Okay. When elasticity is lesser than 1, we can say that the demand is said to be relatively elastic if the percentage change in demand is greater than the percentage change in the price. A lesser change in the price causes more change in the quantity demanded. There we call it as an relatively elastic demand, and we represented it elasticity is greater than 1. So, example is also written, if the price falls by 5% suppose, and the demand rises by more than 5%, say 10% the demand increases, then it is the case of relatively elastic demand, and usually that happens in case of luxurious goods, right. Usually in the case of luxurious items, whenever their price decreases, their demand increases more than the proportionate change taking place in the price of that commodity, right. Like example of car you can take, television, furniture. So, in these cases your demand is relatively inelastic, and when we represent it on the graph, we represented it in this way, where you can see clearly a lesser change in the price causes more change in the quantity demanded. Therefore, the elasticity is always greater than 1. Moving ahead, we have relatively inelastic demand. Now, this is the case where more change in the prices causes a lesser change in the quantity demanded. Therefore, here the elasticity is lesser than 1. So, the demand is said to be relatively inelastic if the percentage change in the quantity demanded is lesser than the percentage change in the price. That is, if there is a small change in demand taking place, and which case causes a greater change in the price, it is also called as less elastic or simply inelastic demand. So, again we are seeing here when the price falls by 10%, but the demand rises only by say 5%, then it is a case of relatively inelastic demand, and here is how we represent this relatively inelastic demand. More change in the price causes lesser change in the demand. A percentage change in the demand is lesser than change in the price, and usually this happen in case of items of addiction, right. People who are addictive of certain items, even if the price of those commodity increases, their demand does not decreases much. So, these are the different degrees of price elasticities we have talked about. 5 degrees we have for price elasticity. Perfectly elastic like I said is an imaginary situation that does not happen in a real case. We do not have any such goods where even if there is no change taking place in the price causes lot of change in the quantity demanded, right. Then we have perfectly inelastic demand. This is the case where even if the prices increases or decreases, the demand does not changes, right. Quantity demanded will remain same, and that happens usually in the case of items like salt, like medicines. Okay. Whereas in case of unitary elastic demand, in this case there causes a equal change in the price as well as quantity demanded. Okay. Whatever the percentage has been increased in the price, the same percentage change has been taken place in the quantity demanded, and this is unitary elastic where your elasticity is equals to 1, and usually that happens in the case of clothes. Whenever we buy clothes, usually this unitary elastic pattern is being seen, and the curve is called as rectangular hyperbola curve. Then we have relatively elastic demand where the elasticity is greater than 1. In this case, a lesser change in the price causes more change in the quantity demanded, and this happens usually in case of luxurious goods. We denote it with elasticity greater than 1. And lastly, we have talked about relatively inelastic demand where the elasticity is lesser than 1, right. A more change in the price causes lesser change in the quantity demanded, and that happens usually in the items of addiction. Okay. So, let us move further. Next topic we are going to talk about here is the methods, right. What are the methods through which we can calculate this price elasticity of demand? We have seen the degrees, how price is affecting the demand of commodities differently depending upon the nature of that commodity. So, here we have 3 methods which we are going to discuss for calculating the price elasticity of demand. The very first method is called as ratio or percentage method. Then we have arc elasticity method, and the third one is your total outlay method. So, let us talk about the very first method where we are going to discuss ratio or percentage method. Some people also called it as in point elasticity method, because this method basically help you to measure the elasticity at a specific point, what change has been taken place in the quantity demanded due to the change in the price. We calculate it through the ratio or percentage method, and the formula to calculate this price elasticity by ratio or percentage method is very simple. This is how we write it: Q2 minus Q1, that is the new quantity minus the previous quantity upon Q1, whole upon P2 minus P1 divided by P1. P2 is again the new price, the change price, and the previous price. This we can also write delta Q upon Q, delta P upon P, and we are talking about the price of same commodity. So, we are representing it here for the same commodity, right. This is how we can calculate what change has been taken place in the quantity demanded because of change in the price of a commodity, right. So, this is again a very simple way of calculating price elasticity, and the simple formula can be used to measure price elasticity by the ratio or percentage method. Moving ahead with the next method is called as arc elasticity method. This arc elasticity method is an extension to your ratio and percentage method when we want to measure the elasticity between 2 points. See, like I said, percentage or ratio method will help you to measure the elasticity at a specific point, whereas when we talk about the arc, on the demand curve, and we want to measure the elasticity between these 2 points, right. So, in that case we are going to use this arc elasticity method. Arc elasticity method is helping you to find out the relationship or find out the change taken place between 2 points. Then we use this arc elasticity method. Moreover, measuring price elasticity at a single point does not represent the full arc. That is why also people use this arc elasticity method. So, to avoid any confusion and to have a full representation of complete arc between the quantity 1 and the price 1, as well as the change quantity and the change price, usually people take the average of 2 prices and 2 quantities as a base to calculate it. So, this is how we represent the formula of arc elasticity method. Earlier we have only taken the previous price and the previous quantity in the base when we have calculated it through the ratio or percentage method, but with the arc elasticity method we take the previous price and the new price as well as the old quantity and the new quantity as a base to represent the full arc or to represent the full elasticity between 2 points, right. So, that depends upon the purpose. If you want to calculate the elasticity at a single point, you use this ratio or percentage method, or when you want to represent the full arc or you want to measure the elasticity between 2 points, we use this formula given by arc elasticity method. We do have the another method of calculating the price elasticity, which is called as total outlay method, right, and this method is different from the previous two methods, because the previous two methods were able to give you elasticity in numbers, right, where you can easily say whether the elasticity is greater than 1, lesser than 1 or equals to 1 or equals to 0. Where in case of total outlay method, just by looking at the expenditure, and how do we find out this total outlay? Total outlay is basically the total expenditure, which can be easily calculated by price into quantity, right. When we multiply the price with the quantity, we get the total outlay, and looking at the figures of total outlay, we can simply say that whether the product is of elastic nature or inelastic nature, or it is of unitary elastic, right. So, it will only help you to know the nature of that commodity, but this method will not be giving you the elasticity in exact number like we were getting in our previous two methods, right. So, let us look how we calculate the price elasticity with this total outlay method. Here is a situation 1 we are considering. You can see this table. In this we have 3 columns. In the very first column we have the prices, and then in the next column we are representing the quantity demanded, and there in the third column we are having this total outlay, right. So, when the price of apple was 12 rupees and the quantity demanded was 10 kgs. So, the total outlay was 120, okay. At the price 12, people were demanding 10 kgs of apple, which gives you the total outlay of 120, and you can see when the price of this apple reduces from 12 rupees to 10 rupees, the demand increases, right. People shifted their demand from 10 kgs to 12 kgs, but you can see the total outlay remains the same. Here there is no change in the total outlay. That means whatever the change has been taken place in the price of the commodity, the same proportionate change has been taken place in the demand of that commodity, which keeps your total outlay equal. That means this product is unitary elastic. The elasticity here is equals to 1 because the total outlay remains the same, right. Moving ahead, let us discuss the second situation. Same, we have taken the 3 columns. Here also we are representing the price. When the price of apple was 12 rupees, the quantity demanded was 10, which makes the total outlay of 120. Now, we can see when the price reduces to rupees 10, but the demand now increase from 10 kgs to 14 kgs. That means a lesser change in the price causes more change in the quantity demanded. Here your total outlay will increase to 120 from 140 to 120, right. So, here this total outlay represents that the product is of elastic nature. That means a lesser change in the price causes more change in the quantity demanded, and here the elasticity is greater than 1. Okay. Moving ahead, we have this third point to understand whether the product is of elastic or inelastic nature. Again, we have taken the same example. At price 12, people were demanding 10 kgs of apple, where the total outlay was 120. Price reduced to 10 rupees, quantity demanded increased, right. Quantity demanded increased, but the increase is very little, right. And total outlay reduced to 110. That means a more change in the price causes a lesser change in the quantity demanded. Quantity demanded change, but there is a lesser change taken place in the quantity demanded, and because of that the total outlay reduced from 120 to 110, which represent the product is of inelastic nature, right. There will be a change taking place in the quantity demanded, but a lesser change is going to take place because the product is of inelastic nature, right. And here the elasticity is lesser than 1, right. The elasticity is lesser than 1 in this case. So, I believe these methods are also clear. 3 methods we have discussed here: ratio or percentage method, the very first method, This method is used to calculate the elasticity at a specific point, right, and there is a little change for calculating this method. We use only the previous quantity and the previous price for calculating the elasticity at a specific point, whereas in arc elasticity method we use this when we want to measure the elasticity between 2 points and to represent the full arc. We use this arc elasticity method and we make some change to our previous method formula, where we are also taking the previous quantity and the new quantity as a base, as well as previous price and the new price as a base. Okay. And the third is your total outlay method. Here in this method you are not going to get elasticities in terms of number, but yes, looking at the figures of total outlay you can find out whether the product is of elastic nature, inelastic nature, or it is unitary elastic. Okay. So, now let us move to the linear demand curve. Here in this curve I have shown the different points of elasticity we have studied. You can see that when the demand curve is of linear nature, we have this formula to calculate elasticity of price, where we are putting, suppose if I give a name to these points, this is A, B, and this is suppose M point, right. So, at the middle point we have elasticity equals to n, above to this we have elasticity greater than 1, and then we have infinity, and below to this we have elasticity lesser than 1, and then elasticity is equals to 0. So, here in this formula what we use is, we use the lower segment of the demand curve upon the upper segment of the demand curve. Here we can also write it like we have denoted it. The lower segment will be MB and the upper segment will be AM. So, this is how we would be able to represent the different degrees of price on the linear demand curve, right. Now, we have determinants of price elasticity of demand. What are the factors which affects the price elasticity of demand, and how different commodities are differently associated with the price elasticity of demand. So, the very first point is the nature of the commodity. So, nature of commodity has a considerable impact on the elasticity, whether the product is of luxurious good or product is a necessary goods. That depends that affects the lot of commodity, right. So, nature of commodity has a considerable impact on the elasticity, because if the product is of luxurious nature, right, when the product is of luxurious nature, that means that product is more of inelastic nature, because here whenever the price of these commodity increases. Okay. So, now let us talk about the determinants of price elasticity of demand. The very first point talk about the nature of commodity. Nature of commodity has a very significant impact on the elasticity concept. We can say that the necessary goods are of inelastic nature, because these are necessary goods even if the price of these commodity changes much, but their demand does not affect it, right, or it affected very less, because they are necessary goods, whereas the item of luxuries or luxuries goods are of elastic nature, because whenever the price of these commodities changes, their demand affects a lot. Okay. So, the nature of commodity is the very first point, where we have studied that inelastic nature, necessary goods are of inelastic nature, whereas luxurious goods are of elastic nature. Then second is availability and proximity of substitute. Yes, again this is important. If the substitute of any commodity is available, definitely the demand for that product is of elastic nature, because if the price of that commodity will decrease, people will shift their demand to the another commodity. But in case if the availability of substitute is not there, suppose you are having a petrol car and the price of petrol increases, you will not be able to change your petrol car overnight into a diesel car, right. So, you are not left with any choices, you have to fill up your tank with the petrol on the higher prices also. So, in this case the demand will be of inelastic nature. Okay. So, if the substitutes are not available, the demand will be inelastic, and if the substitutes of the commodities are available, demand will be of elastic nature. Alternative uses of commodities. Yes, of course, there are items which can be used for different purposes, like electricity can be used for different purposes, like milk can be used for different purposes. So, there are many items which can be used for different purposes. These are just example I am giving you. So, when the price of these goods increases, what we do? we try to make their use very specific and we try to use them for their very specific purpose, right, or for which they are being used particularly, right, and we stop using their other uses which are not required very much. So, basically the demand of these items are of elastic nature. Okay. The items which are used for different purposes are of elastic nature, because whenever their price increases or decreases, we shift our usage of these commodities, right. Whereas, the demand for the items which cannot be replaced, like if we want calculator, if we want to calculate something which can be done through a calculator only, then in that case the demand for that item will be of inelastic nature, because we cannot avoid that specific use of that commodity, right. So, the commodities which are used for some specific purpose, demand for those commodities are of inelastic nature, whereas the commodities which can be used for different purposes, the demand for those commodities are of elastic nature. Then proportion of income spent on the commodity, again very important, right. The items on which you spend a very insignificant proportion of your income, like matchbox. If the price of matchbox increases, will you reduce your demand for the consumption? How many matchboxes are you going to buy? Not more than 2 or 3, right. So, it hardly matters to you, even if the price of matchbox increases or decreases, you will not change its demand much. So, comparatively the items on which we spend a very insignificant proportion of our income, they are of inelastic nature, whereas the items on which we spend comparatively a significant proportion of our income, they are of elastic nature. So, if their price changes, definitely our demand going to get affected. Time is also important factor. In short run, usually the demand is of inelastic nature, because we do not have much choices. As we already know, short run is a period which is not enough for us to change to any new situation. Whatever we are having, we can do the best with it, right. So, usually in short run, the demand for the commodities are of inelastic nature, whereas in long run, because it is a planning horizon, we can plan out, we can have different options where we can explore them. So, that is of elastic nature. The example which I have given you, right, in case of availability of substitute, suppose right now I am having a petrol car, but in future I might shift to in EV vehicle, right, electronic vehicle I can shift to, or I can buy a diesel car. So, in long run usually the demand is of elastic nature. Then we have durability of commodities. Yes, the commodities which are of recurring nature, right, which we demand again and again, are of inelastic nature, whereas durable consumer goods are having demand of elastic nature, because we are not demanding them again and again. So, whenever we demand them, we usually refer to their prices, and we can also shift their demand for a period of time. So, that is why the demand for durable consumer goods are of elastic nature, whereas demand of those goods which comes again and again, or which we demand again and again, are of inelastic nature. And lastly, we have items of addiction. Items of addiction, yes, the items which are of addictive nature, their demand is definitely inelastic. People who have a habit of drinking tea, right, those who are addicted to drink tea, so usually the price of tea increases, then also their demand does not affect it much. So, in this case the demand will be inelastic. So, these are some determinants of price elasticity of demand. I hope it is clear to every one of you. Now, we have implications also, right. Whatever we have talked about price elasticity of demand, what it is, what are the different degrees we have, how do we calculate it, what factors affect it, but what is the implication of price elasticity of demand, why are we studying this, right, what help it is going to provide us. So, these are some answer to this question which I am asking right now, that very first help it is going to provide to the monopolist, right. And who is the monopolist? Monopolist is a person who is a single seller or does not have a any competitor, right. He is the single seller in the market, and the product which he is selling is also not having any substitute. So, he is basically the price maker, right. He himself charges the prices of the commodity. So, for monopolist also it is very important to know whether the product which he is selling is of elastic nature or inelastic nature, right. So, accordingly he can charge the prices. Okay. If the product for a monopolist is of inelastic nature. That means it is not going to change much even if there is a change in the price taking place. So, for the monopolist, what he can do, if the product is of inelastic nature, he can charge higher prices from the consumer because product is of inelastic nature. But yes, if his product is of elastic nature, then definitely to increase his profit margin, he should be reducing the price, or he should reduce the price or sell it at a lesser price as compared to the product which is of inelastic nature. So, it is helpful for the monopolist to know whether the product is of elastic nature or inelastic nature, because he is the price maker, he has to determine the prices for his product. And one thing also for monopolist is a person who can use price discrimination. He can also charge different prices from different consumers for the same commodity. So, again for him, he has to know for whom the demand is of elastic nature and for whom the demand is of elastic nature. Then second is price determination. Yes, of course, not only for the monopolist, but for the other market structures also we have to determine the prices. So, how are we going to determine the prices of a commodity? What factors affect the demand of the commodity? And as we all know, price is a very important factor. So, how our product is being affected by the price, right? Whether the product is of elastic nature or inelastic nature, how are we going to determine the prices of those commodities? There this price elasticity concept is very helpful. Then for taking up public utility services, right? Public utility services are those services which are demanded by the public, right? Like railways, like water, right? Like you can say telephone services, these are some utility, transport facilities, these are some public utility services, and public utility services are of inelastic nature. So, government usually take those public utility services who are in inelastic in nature, they usually keep them under their control and does not give the control to the private sector, because in that case there are more chances of exploitation of customers, right. So, for taking up public utility services which are of inelastic nature, government try to keep those services with themselves. Okay. Otherwise, the private people or the private owners will charge the higher prices of those services, and in that case customer will be exploited. Then it is also helpful in tax determination, because government also determine the taxes, and usually government charges more taxes on the commodities which are of inelastic nature, right. So, for the determination of taxes also price elasticity concept is important. Government can charge higher prices on those commodities which are of inelastic nature, because their demand will not get affected much. But yes, of course, the products which are of elastic nature, usually the tax rate should be lesser on those commodities, because it will affect the price, and when price will be affected, their demand will also affect more. And lastly, we are also having the importance in international trade. Whenever we are exporting and importing certain items, we can keep this consideration of price elasticity for bargaining purpose. If suppose I am exporting some kind of a product which is of inelastic nature, then definitely I can always charge higher prices from the purchaser, because my product is of inelastic nature. But if I am exporting any item which is of elastic nature, then definitely I have to compromise with the prices, or I have to reduce the price so that I would be able to make a sale, right. So, this is how we use the concept of price elasticity, and this price elasticity concept helps us to know the responsiveness of quantity demanded, or change in the quantity demanded due to the change in the price, and we can apply this concept into different areas and different aspects to make a right decision, right. So, I hope this elasticity of price is clear to every one of us. And now let us move to the next type of elasticity, which is called as income elasticity of demand, right. So, this is how we are going to study how income will affect the change in the quantity demanded. So, as we all know, income is also a very important determinant of demand, and a higher income implies more purchasing power, generating to the higher demand for commodities. This is a simple statement we usually make, that higher income will lead the higher purchasing power to the people, and when person is having a more purchasing power, they can demand more of the commodities. But income elasticity can be defined as a degree of responsiveness of quantity demanded to the given change in income. Here we are going to study the impact on the quantity demanded due to the change in income, And I believe all of you are able to understand up to this point that whatever the elasticity we are studying at that point of time, we have to assume other factors to be constant, like we have studied in law of demand, right. Like in law of demand, we were studying the relationship between the price and demand. So, we have assumed other factors to be constant. Same in the case of elasticity, when we were establishing the relationship of price on quantity demanded, we have assumed other factors to be constant like income, price of other goods, taste and preferences. Same is the case when I am establishing a relationship of income on quantity demanded, I have to assume other factors to be constant. So, this ceteris paribus assumption has to be made everywhere whenever we are studying this concept of elasticity, because we are studying only one variable at a time, right. In the words of Professor Watson, income elasticity of demand is the rate of change with respect to change in income or other determinants remaining constant. As you can see here in the definition given by Watson, it is already written here, keeping other factors constant, we measure the change taken place in the quantity demanded due to the change in the income of a consumer. Now, again these are the formulas, or this is the way you can calculate the income elasticity. Here we are denoting income with Y, the percentage change in the quantity demanded upon percentage change in the income, or the other way you can write is change in the quantity demanded upon initial quantity demanded, that means the previous quantity demanded on the previous income or the initial income. So, this is another way of expanding the same formula, and then you can also write Q2 minus Q1 upon Q1, Y2 minus Y1 upon Y1. Y2 is the new income and Y1 is the initial income, where same is the case, Q2 is the new quantity demanded and Q1 is the previous quantity demanded. So, these are the different ways of writing the same method through which you can calculate income elasticity. Now, let us look at the degrees of income elasticity. Like we have divided the price elasticities into 5 types, same we have income elasticities degrees also, and here we have divided them into 0 income elasticity, negative income elasticity and positive income elasticity. Now, what is this positive income elasticity? Positive income elasticity says that whenever there is an increase in the income, right, whenever there will be an increase in the income of a consumer, the quantity demanded for these goods will also increase, and that is why it is having a positive income elasticity, right. So, a good that has a positive income elasticity is regarded to as a normal good, right. In case of normal goods, we have this positive income elasticity because whenever the income of the consumer increases, demand for these goods keeps on increasing, and this happen usually in case of clothes, jewelry, etc. So, these are the normal goods and they are positively related with the quantity demanded in terms of income. Zero income elasticity, there are certain goods, right, where there will be no change in the quantity demanded even if the income of a consumer increases, right. If my income increases, I will not consume more of the salt. If my income decreases, I will also not decrease my consumption of salt, right. So, there are items in the case of matchbox, in the case of salt, in case of medicines, in case of postcards also. So, these are the items where there will be no effect taking place, right, where there will be no change taking place in the quantity demanded even if the income of a consumer increases or decreases, and that is why we call it as an zero income elasticity. Next is the negative income elasticity. As you can see, the word negative implies the opposite, right. So, inverse relationship is there. So, for the purchase of these commodity, we can say that whenever the income of a consumer increases, quantity demanded for these item will reduce, right. Rather than they increase, the demand for these commodities will be decreased because these goods are being treated as an inferior goods, right. Inferior goods, there is no such definition for inferior goods and there are no such defined inferior good. That depends upon the income level of a consumer. Maybe the goods which is superior for me is inferior for other, and maybe the good which is inferior for me is superior for other. Okay. So, that depends upon the income level of a person, but definitely whenever the demand for a income of a person increases, they will demand for more quality goods or the better quality goods. So, inferior goods are basically those goods which are lower in quality. So, you can give an example of like quality of cereal, the poor quality of cereals or the better quality of cereals you will start demanding when your income increases. So, these goods will have a negative income effect because people will shift their demand to the better quality goods. So, this is how we establish the relationship of income with the quantity demanded, and we have these 3 degrees: positive income elasticity, 0 and negative income elasticity. Then here we have also a curve which is called as angel curve, and why we are talking this angel curves with this income elasticity of demand, because here we have established the relationship of income with the quantity demanded, and this angel curve was studied by Ernest Angel, right. He was a German statistician. He had made a extensive study of relationship between the income and the consumption of commodities, right. How he has studied this income effect on the consumption of commodities. Let us look here. He has given the 3 commodities. One are being considered to be as a necessary goods, then we have luxurious goods, and we have inferior goods also. So, in case of necessary goods, we can see that the demand of these goods will increase initially whenever the income of the consumer increases, but they will increase up to the point and thereafter it will not increase. Okay, the consumption of these goods will initially shift their demand, but after a point of time they will become stable. There will be no further growth taking place even if the income of the consumer increases. Whereas, in case of luxurious goods, the income of whenever the income of the consumer increases, the demand for these goods keeps on increases, which establish again a positive relationship. Whereas, in case of inferior goods, like I said, these are the lower quality goods. So, whenever the income of a consumer increases, demand for these goods not increase, rather this will decrease. Okay. So, the demand curve is going backward, which represent the quantity demanded will decrease for these goods when the income of a consumer going to increase. So, this is how the Ernest Angel established the income and the consumption pattern with different commodities, right. Now, if we look at the implication of income elasticity of demand, income elasticity of demand is also very important for us to understand, because different commodities, different firms, different units, people who are producing goods which are of superior or inferior nature, they can easily find out what impact is going to take place on their quantity demanded if their income of the consumer is increasing or decreasing, because we have different phases in the economy, contraction and expansion phases take place. So, the people who are producing superior good, they can expect there will be a rise in their commodity if the expansion in the economy taking place, and vice versa. Then we have this cross elasticity of demand. Cross elasticity of demand is basically the concept where we are establishing the relationship between the quantity demanded of commodity X because of and the change in the price of commodity Y, right, price of related goods, right. What happens in the demand of the quantity of commodity X because of change in the price of commodity Y. So, that particular relationship would be considered as an cross elasticity of demand, and that is how we call it. So, here you have to see this carefully, that commodity X is going to be studied, demand for commodity X is going to be studied because of change in the price of commodity Y. So, here again we have positive and negative cross elasticity. Positive cross elasticity will be there in case of substitute goods. When the products are of substitute nature, we can see that when the price of X increases, the demand for Y increases. The demand for Y will increase when the price of X will increase, because they are substitute. People will shift their demand from one commodity to the another commodity, right. So, cross elasticity we can say is having a positive impact on the case of substitute goods, whereas it will have a negative impact in case of complementary goods, because complementary goods are those goods which are demanded jointly, right, which creates a joint demand, like car and petrol. When price of one commodity increases, the demand for the other commodity will decrease, right. So, here there is a negative impact. For the implication of cross elasticity, we can say that we can find out how many substitutes, how many complementary goods are available for our commodity. It is again a very important aspect for the firms to know how many substitutes are available and how they are related with the price of those commodities. So, for that we study this cross elasticity of demand. And lastly, like we have talked about the supply concept, we have price elasticity of supply, and as we all know, supply is positively related to the price of any commodity. So, whenever the price of any commodity increases, quantity supplied, the proportionate change taking place in the quantity supplied, we study under this price elasticity concept. Okay, and this is how we calculate it. percentage change in the quantity supplied of commodity X upon percentage change in the price of goods X, right. So, these are the topics which we have covered today. We have talked about the elasticity concept, the different types of elasticities, their implication, and lastly we have talked about price elasticity of supply. I hope it is clear to every one of you. These are some reference books taken for this particular lecture. Thank you all of you.